It's October 1994, and a desperate search for two young boys has gripped the nation.
I want to say to my babies that your mama loves you so much.
Their mother, Susan Smith, claims she's been carjacked and her sons, Michael and Alex, taken by a black man. The boy's father, David Smith, sticking by his wife's side, just like much of the country. But it's all a lie. After 9 days of searching, Susan Smith confesses to buckling her boys into the family car and driving it into a lake. Susan Smith is convicted for their deaths and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Now, 3 decades later, Smith is up for parole. And for the first time since her trial, she will hear her ex-husband David speak out to oppose her release.
It was a quiet evening in South Carolina when Susan Smith walked into the local police station with a story that would grip the nation. Her voice trembled, her eyes filled with tears, and her heartbroken words painted a terrifying scene. She claimed that a stranger had stolen her car, with her 2 young boys, Michael and Alex, trapped inside. The moment those words left her lips, the ordinary town that once trusted her felt the shock ripple through every home, every family, every heart. Suddenly, the unimaginable was possible. A mother's worst nightmare was no longer a story. It was real, and it was unfolding before the eyes of millions. Before we continue, I want you to pause for a moment. Picture the fear, the helplessness, the desperation that any parent would feel. Now, let us pray for Michael and Alex, the 2 young boys at the center of this tragedy. Lord, watch over Michael and Alex. Surround them with your love and protection. Comfort all children who face danger, and bring peace to those who grieve. Amen. If you prayed with me, type Amen in the comments below, and don't forget to share where you're watching from. Let's create a circle of love and remembrance for these innocent lives. Susan's story didn't just stay in the police station, it spread like wildfire. News crews arrived, cameras rolled, and soon, her emotional pleas were broadcast across the nation. Millions of people watched her interviews, feeling her fear, sharing her pain, and hoping against hope that the children would be found alive. Every detail she gave was dissected, replayed, and shared. The community joined in, organizing searches, praying, and offering support. Strangers donated time, resources, and energy, all in the name of helping 2 little boys who had suddenly vanished. Can you imagine the weight of this moment? Millions of eyes on her, everyone believing her, every hope pinned on a mother's words. Take a moment and think. How would you feel if you were in that town, in that moment? And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Stories like these remind us that life is fragile, truth is precious, and every detail matters. You won't want to miss a single part of this journey. Susan's story spread across the nation like wildfire. She claimed that her 2 young boys, Michael and Alex, had been taken by a stranger late that evening. The town she lived in, a place where everyone knew each other, was stunned. News crews arrived almost immediately, cameras rolling as Susan told her story, tears streaming down her face, pleading for help. Millions of viewers watched at home, captivated by a mother's fear and the disappearance of 2 innocent children. The night Susan Smith reported her children missing, the town of Union, South Carolina, was thrown into chaos. She claimed that a stranger had taken her car with her 2 young boys, Michael and Alex, inside. Her story was heartbreaking, and her tears and pleas on camera captured the attention of millions across the nation. Authorities launched a massive search immediately. Officers combed roads, forests, and nearby lakes, following every lead. Neighbors and volunteers joined the hunt, driven by a desperate hope that the boys would be found safe. Across the country, people prayed and watched closely, captivated by a mother's heartbreak. Yet behind the scenes, detectives began noticing something unusual. Small details in Susan's account didn't quite fit. She had said she was at the grocery store at a certain time, but surveillance footage showed no record of her there. Witnesses claimed they had seen her at home later than she had reported. The timeline of events, though subtle at first, raised questions that investigators couldn't ignore. Law enforcement also examined her interactions during the search. Certain behaviors, like avoiding specific questions or hesitating when describing events, added to their growing unease. While the public continued to empathize with her story, the investigators were beginning to see cracks forming in the narrative. Susan's words, broadcast on television, painted a picture of a devastated mother. Yet the detectives knew that appearances could be deceiving. Every discrepancy, every hesitation, and every contradiction would later prove to be a critical piece of the puzzle. For now, though, the search continued, and the nation waited, unaware that the story they believed might not be the truth. As the search for Michael and Alex stretched into its second day, detectives began to dig deeper into Susan Smith's story. Every statement she had given was carefully reviewed, every timeline cross-checked, and every witness interviewed. They were searching not just for the boys, but for the truth hidden behind a narrative that had captivated the nation. It didn't take long for inconsistencies to appear. Susan had claimed she drove along a specific route when the children were taken, but no one along that route had seen her car. Phone records indicated she had been at home during the same window she claimed to be out. Even the small details, what she said she had packed for the boys, what she remembered from the neighborhood, didn't always align with the physical evidence. Detectives quietly began to piece together a troubling picture. The more they analyzed, the more it seemed that the story of a stranger taking the children might not be true. Yet at this stage, there was no public awareness of these doubts. News outlets continued to broadcast Susan's tearful pleas, and the nation remained gripped by hope that the boys would be found alive. Investigators also began to examine Susan's personal life. Friends and neighbors described her as polite but sometimes distant. Financial stress and relationship tensions had been quietly building, and detectives wondered if these pressures might be linked to the case. The deeper they looked, the more questions arose. Could a mother under such strain act in a way so unthinkable? And if so, what had really happened to Michael and Alex? While the public prayed and the search went on, detectives were working behind the scenes, following every clue, every contradiction, and every shadow of doubt. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the full picture, the shocking truth, was still hidden, waiting to be revealed. As the investigation deepened, detectives began to uncover more inconsistencies in Susan Smith's story.
It wasn't a sudden
Every
revelation,
statement she had made
but a
was
slow,
cross-checked against
rhythmic
evidence,
accumulation of
timelines,
inconsistencies.
and witness accounts.
When we look at the
And the
footage
more they
now, we
analyzed,
see the
the more
performance
the
of a
pieces
life.
didn't fit.
Susan Smith
Susan
sat
had
on
described
park
a
benches,
stranger taking her
clutching her
car with
husband's
Michael
hand,
and Alex inside,
describing a black
yet there were no
carjacker who had
witnesses to
stopped
such
her
an
at a
event.
red light.
The route she
She spoke
claimed
of
to
his
have driven
clothes,
was
his
empty,
voice,
and neighbors
his demand
reported
that she
seeing her
get
at
out of the
home
car.
during times she
But
said she was
detectives in
elsewhere.
Union began
Even
to look
small
at the
details,
geometry
the
of the
children's
story.
clothing,
They
the
looked
bag
at
she
the
said she
timing.
packed, did not
They
match
looked at
what
the
was
red
later
light she
discovered.
claimed had stayed red for an
Investigators
eternity,
also noted her
despite
behavior
no
during
other cars
interviews.
being on the road.
Certain
This
answers
is where
seemed
the shift
rehearsed.
occurs,
At times,
from the
she avoided
psychological
looking at
exploration
officers'
of a mother's
eyes or
mind to the
hesitated when
cold,
describing critical
factual
moments.
gravity of a
These
criminal
subtle cues
investigation.
were enough to
Law
raise serious
enforcement
doubts.
didn't move with aggression.
Experienced detectives
They
know
moved
that
with a quiet,
inconsistencies are
observant
often the
patience.
first sign of a
They
story
watched
that
her
doesn't tell the
language.
whole truth.
They noticed how
At the
she
same
spoke
time,
of her
the
children
search
in the
for
past
Michael
tense
and
before
Alex
they were even
continued.
found.
Volunteers
They
combed
noticed
woods
the
and
emotional
waterways.
flatness
Law
that would
enforcement
occasionally
followed
slip
every
through the
lead,
mask when
and
the
the public
cameras weren't
held on
clicking.
to hope.
While the
Yet
public
behind
was
the
looking
scenes,
for a
the
monster in the
investigation
woods,
was quietly
the
shifting
FBI
from
was
a rescue
looking at a
mission
letter.
to something
It
far
was the
more
letter from
complex.
Tom
A
Findley,
search not just
the
for the
man
children,
Susan
but
believed
for the
was her
real
ticket
story
to
of
a
what had
different
happened.
life.
As
In it,
detectives
he hadn't
reviewed
just
Susan's
ended the
personal
relationship.
history,
He
additional
had highlighted
questions
her children
emerged.
as the
She
primary
was dealing
reason
with
why they could
financial
never be together.
difficulties and strained
He told
relationships,
her she was a
and
good
her
person,
emotional state was
but he
fragile.
wasn't ready for a
Could
family.
these pressures
In the
have played a
perpetrator's
role in
mind,
what occurred?
this wasn't
The
just a
investigators
breakup note.
didn't speculate
It was a
publicly,
roadmap.
but privately,
It was a clear
they knew they were
indication that
approaching
for
a
Susan
turning
to have
point.
the future she
Every
craved,
piece of evidence,
the present
every
had to be
discrepancy,
erased.
and
The
every
interrogation
unanswered
that
question
finally
was
broke
slowly
the case
building
was
toward a
not a scene
revelation
of
that would
shouting
shock
or
the entire
high-stakes
nation.
drama.
The
It was a
truth behind the
slow,
disappearance of
deliberate
Michael and
unraveling.
Alex was closer than anyone
Investigators
could
sat
imagine,
with Susan,
and soon,
gently
the story
pointing
that
out
had
that the
captured
physics
hearts
of her
across the
story
country would
didn't
take a
match
dark
the
and
reality of the
unexpected
road.
turn.
They didn't
As
treat her like a
detectives
killer.
continued to dig
They
into
treated her
Susan
like
Smith's
a woman
life,
who was
a more
tired of holding
complicated
a heavy
picture
secret.
began to emerge.
And eventually,
On
the
the
weight
surface,
became too
she
much.
appeared to be a
The
devoted
confession,
mother,
when it finally
but
came,
closer
was
scrutiny
fragmented.
revealed a life
It
marked
lacked
by
the narrative
pressures and
flow of her
struggles that had
earlier
largely
lives.
gone
It was a
unnoticed.
stuttering,
Financial
insufficient
difficulties,
explanation that
marital
centered not on the
tensions,
boys,
and emotional emotional
but on her
instability
own
all
feeling of
painted a
being
portrait
trapped.
of someone under
She
significant
spoke
stress.
of the car rolling,
Investigators
of the water,
began to
of her
explore
standing
whether
on
these
the shore.
personal challenges
There was
could
no
be linked
mention
to
of
the
the boys'
disappearance
cries.
of Michael
There
and
was
Alex.
only the mention
Friends
of her
and
own
neighbors
despair.
described Susan
In
as
that
polite
moment,
and
the
seemingly
mother in
ordinary,
mourning
but
vanished,
some recalled
and
moments
the
of
world was
unusual
forced
behavior,
to look at the reality
short
of
tempers,
Susan Smith,
secretive actions,
a woman
and
who
sudden
had chosen
emotional
control
outbursts.
over life.
While these
I want to say how very sorry I am.
It's okay, Susan. Just talk with us.
And I love Michael and Alex with all my heart.
Influence of drugs or alcohol the night that you murdered your children?
No, ma'am, I was not.
Your attorney talked about working with mental health. Is that helpful to you?
Ma'am,
Mr. Thomas
I hear you.
Mr. Thomas talked about the fact that you were working with mental health, and my question is that helpful to you?
Yes, ma'am.
Is that something that you would be willing to continue with on the outside if you were granted parole?
Yes, ma'am.
Ms. Smith, your crime took a lot of resources from the law enforcement community. What, if anything, would you say to the folks who worked so hard to find your children if you had the opportunity to speak to them today?
That I'm sorry that I put them through that. I really, really am. And I'm especially sorry to the drivers that I had to find them. I wish I could take that back. I really do. I was really, and I'm sorry. I don't know. I know that's not enough. I know it's not, but I don't know.
observations alone did not prove guilt. They added pieces to a puzzle that detectives were slowly
drowned her
assembling.
2 little boys,
Meanwhile,
wants out of
every
prison.
inconsistency in Susan's account gained more weight.
53-year-old
The
Smith
timeline of
sobbed
events,
as she
her
appeared
reported
via video
locations,
before a
and
parole
even the
board in
details she
South
gave about
Carolina
preparing for
today.
a Children's Day did not align with what investigators
I
could
know that's not
verify.
enough.
Each
I know it's
discrepancy,
not.
no
But
matter how
are
small,
those crocodile
was a thread leading
tears?
closer
I
to
don't
a
see
larger,
tears,
darker
says
truth.
one reporter
The public,
covering the
however,
story.
remained
What do you
largely
think is the
unaware
most
of these
important thing that you have learned while you
Nationwide,
have been
millions
incarcerated?
continued to
Smith
follow
was there,
Susan's
accompanied
story,
by a
hoping
large
for a miracle
entourage
that Michael
who all
and Alex would be
opposed
found
her
alive.
release. He
Volunteers
wore a
still
photo of
searched,
his sons
media
on his
outlets still
lapel.
broadcast
Well, I'm
his
asking that you
pleas,
please
and communities across America
do not
remained
hurt parole
captivated by
today.
the narrative of a grieving mother. But behind the cameras and the headlines,
And hopefully in the future,
detectives
but
knew something
specifically
fundamental had
today.
shifted.
In
The story they
1994,
were
he stood at
unraveling
her
was no
side,
longer just about a
believing her
missing
story that
children's
she had been
search. It was
carjacked
about
by a
uncovering
black
the
man who
reality of
kidnapped
what
her
had truly
sons,
happened.
Michael and
Every
Alex.
lead, every
I would like
witness
to
account,
say
and
to
every piece of
whoever
evidence brought them closer to the
has my
shocking
children
revelation that would forever change the way the nation
that
viewed
they
Susan
please,
Smith. As the
I mean,
investigation
please bring 'em
intensified,
home.
The
detectives
shocking
gathered
truth
enough
emerged
evidence to
after
confront
9
Susan
days
Smith
when
directly.
cops learned
Every
Smith
detail
had
they
buckled the boys
painstakingly
into their
collected,
kiddie
the
seats
inconsistencies
and
in
rolled her
timeline,
car
the
into a
contradictory
lake.
witness
Susan
statements,
Smith
the physical evidence
has
that
been
didn't
arrested
align with her story
and will
was
be
now
charged
being laid before
with
her.
2 counts of
At
murder
first,
in
Susan
connection
clung to the narrative
with the
of a
deaths of her
stranger
children.
taking her
The
children.
motive? She was
She
having an
cried,
affair with
she
a man
pleaded,
who
and
didn't
she
want
attempted to
children.
explain away
Smith
the
was sentenced to
discrepancies.
life and
But
became
detectives,
eligible for
trained to
parole
read the
this month.
smallest signs of
Susan Smith has had a checkered
deception,
record
noticed that her
behind
story
bars.
was beginning
She was
to
accused of
unravel
having
under
had
scrutiny.
sex with 2
Hesitation,
guards she was
repeated
disciplined
contradictions,
for drug
and subtle
use.
changes in her
Alfred
account
Rowe was one of the
signaled that the
guards
truth
she
was
had
close to the
sex with.
surface.
He lost
Hours
his
of
job and was
questioning
sentenced to
followed.
5 years probation
Investigators
for sexual
remained
misconduct
methodical,
with an inmate.
patient,
She
and
belongs
relentless.
behind bars.
Every question
40
was
minutes
precise,
after Smith
every
made her
detail
plea for
probed,
freedom,
until
the
finally
parole board
facade
voted.
broke.
Ms. Susan Smith is denied parole. The vote is unanimous.
Susan Smith can apply for parole every 2 years. Meantime, David Smith, who remarried and had 2 more children, has said he clings to the few memories he has of his little boy.
Susan's own statement was a return to the private reality.
The woman whom millions had empathized with, whom the media had portrayed as a grieving mother, was now revealed to be responsible for the disappearance of her own children. For law enforcement, the confession validated the suspicions that had quietly grown since the beginning of the investigation. Every inconsistency, every hesitation, every small detail now fit into a horrifyingly clear picture. What had seemed like a tragic story of abduction was, in truth, a calculated and deeply troubling act. Across the nation, the story of Susan Smith would change overnight. The narrative of hope, grief, and prayers for 2 missing boys shifted into one of disbelief, anger, and the harsh reality of betrayal. And in that moment, the investigation had reached a turning point, the point where the truth, no longer hidden, would forever alter the lives of everyone involved. The moment Susan Smith's confession became public, the legacy of the story should not be the woman as a story of empathy and hope for 2 missing boys transformed overnight into a story of betrayal and heartbreak. People struggled to reconcile the image of the grieving mother on television with the reality of her actions. News outlets immediately replayed every interview, every plea, and every tearful moment from the early days of the search. Analysts and commentators dissected her behavior, revisiting every detail in an effort to understand how someone could deceive so many people. Across talk shows, newspapers, and living rooms, the same questions echoed. How could a mother do this? What drove her to commit such a horrifying act? In her hometown, the impact was personal and profound. Neighbors who had prayed with her joined the searches and offered support now faced shock and disbelief. The trust that had defined the community was shattered, replaced by confusion, anger, and grief. Families who had once seen Susan as a figure of tragedy and sympathy now viewed her as a symbol of deception and betrayal. The public's reaction was equally intense. Social media exploded with debates, opinions, and heartbreak. National conversations began about trust, parental responsibility, and how appearances can hide dark truths. Even as the shock settled, people across the country continued to mourn the loss of Michael and Alex, keeping the boys' memory alive amidst the scandal surrounding their mother. For investigators and law enforcement, the confession confirmed what they had suspected all along, but the case now shifted into a new phase: legal proceedings that would expose the full extent of Susan Smith's actions. The narrative had moved from hope to horror, from grief to outrage, and the eyes of the nation remained fixed on the unfolding story. Susan Smith had captivated a nation, but in revealing the truth, she had also shattered it. The story that had begun with empathy and prayers for 2 missing children had become a cautionary tale, one that would leave a lasting mark on the hearts and minds of everyone who followed it. The trial of Susan Smith became a national spectacle. What had started as a story of missing children had evolved into a courtroom drama that would expose the full scale of the tragedy. Reporters, cameras, and spectators filled the courthouse, all eager to witness the legal proceedings unfold. Prosecutors meticulously presented their case. Every inconsistency, every contradiction, and every piece of physical evidence collected during the investigation was laid bare. They traced Susan's movements, reconstructed her timeline, and highlighted the gaps in her story. Witnesses testified, recounting what they had observed, providing context, and adding layers to the narrative that had already captivated the nation. The defense attempted to focus on Susan's emotional state, portraying her as a mother overwhelmed by stress, financial pressures, and emotional instability. But the prosecution's evidence was compelling, and the weight of her actions became increasingly difficult to ignore. The courtroom became a stage for raw emotion, where every statement, every piece of evidence, and every cross-examination added to the chilling portrait of betrayal. For the public, the trial was more than a legal process. It was an insight into how the investigation had uncovered the truth. Viewers could follow the careful, methodical work of law enforcement as they exposed the inconsistencies that had led to Susan's confession. The courtroom proceedings allowed the nation to see how the case unfolded, step by step, and how the seemingly ordinary mother had orchestrated a narrative that had deceived an entire community. The trial also highlighted the human cost of the crime. The loss of Michael and Alex was at the center of every argument, every testimony, and every emotional exchange. While Susan faced the consequences of her actions, the memory of the boys served as a constant reminder of innocence lost and the devastating impact of betrayal. By the time the trial concluded, the nation had witnessed the full story, every deception, every lie, and every heartbreak. Susan Smith's actions were no longer a mystery. They were a documented reality, leaving a permanent mark on the town, the victims' families, and the collective memory of the country. After weeks of testimony and evidence, the moment the nation had been waiting for finally arrived: the verdict. The courtroom was tense, filled with spectators, reporters, and families whose lives had been touched by the case. Outside, the world watched, holding its collective breath. The jury delivered its decision. Susan Smith was found guilty of the crimes against her two young boys, Michael and Alex. The sentence reflected the gravity of her actions, ensuring that justice was served, though the loss could never be undone. Across the country, reactions were intense and emotional. Millions struggled to process the betrayal. A mother, whom they had believed to be grieving and innocent, had been responsible for the unthinkable. Communities that had once rallied around her now wrestled with shock, anger, and heartbreak. In her hometown, the impact was profound. Neighbors who had searched for the children, prayed for their safe return, and offered support now faced the reality of betrayal from someone they had trusted. The sense of safety and trust in the community had been irrevocably shaken. Families and friends were left to reconcile the memory of the woman they thought they knew with the truth of her actions. The trial and verdict also sparked national conversations. People debated parental responsibility, the signs of emotional instability, and how appearances can deceive. The story became a lesson for both law enforcement and the public. Even in the most familiar communities, darkness can hide in plain sight. Yet amidst the heartbreak and outrage, the memory of Michael and Alex remained central. Their lives, though tragically cut short, became a symbol of innocence lost and a reminder of the importance of vigilance, empathy, and accountability. The verdict closed one chapter in the story of Susan Smith, but the emotional impact of the case, and the lessons it carried, would linger for decades. The nation had witnessed a tragedy that was both shocking and unforgettable, a story that would remain etched in collective memory for years to come. The Susan Smith case left an indelible mark on the nation, one that continues to resonate decades later. It was more than a story of a mother and her children. It was a story about trust, deception, and the harsh reality that appearances can be dangerously misleading. For communities across the country, the case became a cautionary tale. It reminded people that even in small towns, even among familiar faces, darkness can hide behind the most ordinary smiles. Law enforcement also took note, learning the importance of scrutinizing every detail, no matter how unlikely it seemed, in missing person investigations. The media, too, learned from the tragedy. Susan Smith's story highlighted the power and the danger of emotional narratives broadcast to millions. The public's empathy, while natural and genuine, demonstrated how easily perception can be shaped before the full truth is revealed. Through all the shock and heartbreak, the memory of Michael and Alex remained at the center. Their lives, though tragically cut short, serve as a reminder of innocence lost and the consequences of deception. The story continues to spark conversations about parental responsibility, trust, and the importance of questioning appearances when the stakes are highest. Even years later, the Susan Smith case is studied and remembered. It stands as a chilling reminder that sometimes, the darkest truths are hidden in plain sight. The lessons it leaves behind are not only about crime and justice but also about human behavior, empathy, and the fragile line between trust and betrayal. Susan Smith's name, once associated with grief and hope, is now synonymous with betrayal and tragedy. A story that shocked a nation, changed a town, and continues to captivate the world of true crime. It is a case that reminds us all that truth, no matter how carefully concealed, will eventually come to light.